Good evening all, and welcome. I hope you're ready for another edition in the deep woods, where we'll be getting our camp gear ready to spend the night. But without further ado, it is time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was younger, I lived on an estate of houses that backed onto a huge field where many people walked their dogs. It was even used as a cut-through to the next neighborhood, which would take approximately 25 minutes to walk through. When I was about 13, my neighbor and I decided to camp out for the night in the back of my garden, which, apart from a 6-foot wooden fence, was completely open to the field, albeit with 20 trees around the fence. Seeing as we were into Action Man figures at the time, we decided to make the tent a hideout. So we got together with some branches and one of those army nets to put over the tent to make it a bit more stealthy. We also put the tent in the corner of the back garden, which had a small roof over it, which made it very dark once the sun went down. We did the usual thing, ate loads of crisps and sweets, before we decided to try and get some sleep in our well-hidden, super dark tent. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone landing and then walking on the small stones. I then realized that below the fence that my mum and dad had decorated, there was some gravel and flower pots. At first I thought it was our cat, but it was far too loud to be such a small animal. I slowly sat up, trying not to make too much noise from my sleeping bag, and then I heard it again. I, once again, tried to make my way to the front of the tent silently, and looked through the zipper. About 10 feet away from us, there were 2 guys dressed all in black, crouching under the windowsill of the kitchen talking to each other. I immediately froze and had no idea what to do. They proceeded to creep closer to us, looking for more windows or maybe an entrance. But because we were in the corner of the garden, we were quite close to the path that led down the side of our houses, where there was a door into the adjoining garage. I heard them talking quite clearly, as they were now less than 5 feet away from me and my friend who was still asleep. They were talking about being unseen, and just taking whatever they could find in the garage instead of breaking into the house and disturbing anyone. I had no idea what to do, so I rang the house phone, which was pretty loud, and waited for someone to answer. It took a while as it was very early, and as soon as the phone rang, the 2 people bolted to the fence and hopped over it. My dad answered, and I whispered for him to get outside ASAP with a bat or something. Nothing happened in the end, but I'm glad that my friend slept silently that night. This is a story from a road trip that my fiancé and I took back in 2010. Our trip had been relatively benign and uneventful, with a few exceptions. One of those was a trip through Colorado. We were on our way to the Rocky Mountains National Park, but it was getting dark and we needed to stop for the night. A quick look at the road atlas showed us that there were a few campgrounds a short hop away. After a short discussion, we decided to try and find a few of them. The paved roads turned into an unpaved washboard-like trail. The trees around us turned from pine to birch, and the forest just felt wrong somehow. But we continued onwards nevertheless, determined to find the damn campground. But after about an hour of driving slowly, so that we didn't shake the car to pieces, we came across one of the camps. The campground was like something from the beginning of a mystery thriller. Everything was overgrown. The fire pits were growing weeds, and the signs were all rusted or shot up, and the moon didn't quite penetrate the trees. We decided that this was not the place for us, and continued onwards. Another hour of driving passed, and it was pitch black, and the roads got amazingly tough in spots for our tiny little Aveo. We resigned ourselves to another night at sleeping at a rest stop, and began to try and find a way out. Suddenly, we saw bright headlights in the road ahead, and we continued forward and found ourselves in quite a large clearing. Headlights from behind us turned on, blinding us from seeing the roads out. 3 men, wearing various expressions of anger and fear, appeared out of the gloom and approached the car. In the bright lights of the 2 trucks, I could now see a burnt-out trailer, and all the men were wearing black clothing. The look of malice on the man approaching my side of the vehicle burnt its way into my brain, and I was instantly terrified. I yelled at my fiancé to floor it, and he was desperately trying to find the exit. We finally saw the trail marking, reflecting across the clearing, and gunned it out of there, with the men jumping out of the way in surprise. The final half hour before we finally found ourselves back in civilization was spent in creeped-out silence. We stuck to sleeping in rest stops and national parks after that. This happened while I was backpacking in the Goat Rocks Wilderness in Washington State. My friends and I were trying to get up into a certain basin above the tree line, and we got a really late start thanks to road construction. So we were really hoofing it up the trail, trying to make camp before dark. My friend hikes way faster than I do, so he got way out ahead of me. And by the time I got to where our detour from the main trail up an informal boot path would take us up into the basin, he was nowhere to be seen. So there were no campsites near where I stopped. I backtracked for about 3/4 of a mile to a lake where there were established campsites right along the trail. After maybe an hour, my friend shows up having realized his mistake, and this was well after dark, and we settled in, not really knowing our surroundings. It was a fairly large open area though, likely a horse camp area, because the trail is popular with horse packers, but we had encountered none. We set up our tents, which were both one-person tents, ate, and went to bed. Neither of us usually slept well when backpacking, but for whatever reason, he was out cold, and I was sort of lucid, but for quite a while, I was just listening to the sounds of nature, and trying not to psych myself out about the possible demons and monsters and man-eating beasts lurking in the woods every time I heard a twig snap or a pine cone fall from a tree. So maybe 3 hours or so after I went to bed, which would have been roughly 1 a.m., I start hearing a very distinct sound of really heavy footsteps around my camp area. maybe as much as 100 feet away. I didn't really think to analyze the patterns of the footsteps made at the time, but I remember it sounding distinctly bipedal. You can usually pick out deer or mountain goat because they don't plant their feet in pairs, other than the occasional footstep. It's basically dead silent. No crickets or rustlings of bushings or anything. That silence was instantly shattered by the most terrifying sound I've ever heard in my life. It was basically the same intensity as a whistle on a steam train, but much, much deeper and more demonic-like. Almost like a cross between a cow mooing and a lion's roar, but loud enough that it echoed off the mountains on the opposite side of the valley. Immediately after the noise, this creature went hauling arse off into the woods, crashing through the bushes. The forest I could see where I set up camp was basically covered in high-head huckleberry shrubs, but remained running around in earshot for at least 2 minutes, running back and forth sometimes, getting distinctly closer, and sometimes getting further away. All this time, it sounded like it was a creature with 2 legs running about. This whole time, my heart was doing about 200 beats a minute, and I was sure I was going to be eaten by a chupacabra or something. After a couple of minutes, the footsteps faded, and it fell silent again, and I never heard anything else. I probably lay awake for at least another hour before I finally slept. My friend didn't hear a damn thing. In the morning when I woke up, I looked around and there was a wide open area that led down to a small beach by the nearby lake, to see if there was any evidence of what the noise was. Turns out, there were fresh elk print in the mud, near the lake, and maybe 20 to 30 feet away was a large print of either a cougar or a bear. So likely something was stalking one of the elk that wandered near my camp, and spooked it in the middle of the night and caused it to spaz out. At least, that's what I hope it was. The moral of the story is, all elk are possessed, all the time. Every summer, I go camping at the same campsite with my grandparents. Now, I was probably 10 years old when this happened, so I don't remember everything. The campsite had separated showers and bathrooms for both males and females. One night, I decided to go and take a shower. My gran was a few camping spots over from ours, having a few drinks with friends, so I didn't want to pull her away. My grandpa couldn't take me into the showers, so I went alone. Stupid, right? Anyway, as I was approaching the showers, I heard a man probably in his late 30s screaming many things to what seemed like 2 girls. It was late, and it was pretty dark, so I would have to get closer to have seen them. When I took a turn into the building, I saw the man was the one who was yelling, waiting outside of the girls' bathroom. Me being an innocent tater-tot, I didn't think anything of it. I was walking towards the door that the man was standing by and said, "Excuse me, sir, people are trying to sleep." Even as a child I was pretty brave, but something about him made me feel like I had to run the other way. He turned to me and I could finally see what his face looked like. He was a dark man with a scruffy beard, and he was wearing a black hoodie that covered his head. He laughed at me and put his hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, sweetie. I'll keep it down." After that, I rushed into the shower room Once I closed the door and locked it, I guess he had heard the lock turn because he whispered, "Shit," and knocked on the door and asked if I could unlock it for him. I ignored it because I heard a whimper behind me. There was an older lady and a little girl, who I guess was her daughter. The mother was holding onto her daughter in the corner, and this made me very confused. I asked her what was wrong, and she said very, very quietly, "That man is trying to abduct us." She sobbed and bared her head into the girl's neck. I told her that I was going to go for help. At first, she didn't want me to go near him again, but I told her that I knew this campsite like the back of my hand, which I do. And I think the guy didn't realize that there was another exit. Criminals these days, jeez. I told her to stay here and lock the door after I left. I ran to the front desk and told the lady working there that there was a man scaring 2 girls that are hiding in the bathroom. I could tell that she was terrified, but she tried to be calm with me. She called what I guess was the police, because a few minutes later I heard the sirens. I wasn't allowed to leave the office, but when I saw the police trucks leave, I saw the man in the back seat, and he looked at me and gave me an evil smile. My grandparents were notified, but they never said anything to me other than, "You probably just saved 2 lives today." I didn't really think about this until now, many, many years later, because I just got a call today that my grandparents want to have a family get-together at the same campsite. Let me give you some background information. I am 18 and living in Dagenham. It's quite a busy area, so there are normally a lot of people around. This particular night, me and my friend Jim were on our way to camp out at the local park. You were never allowed there past 10 p.m, so we would have to hide from the park police. The park we were staying at was always busy up until around 9 p.m. Then it turns to a ghost field. Anyway, on to the story. We had set up for the park at about 8:30, so by the time we got there wouldn't be anyone there to grass us up. We arrived and everything went according to plan. We had the tent, snacks, portable DVD player, and Pokemon Go at the ready. It was perfect. 10 p.m. came, and we heard the park police shutting up the gates. There's quite a lot of them, so it's always easy to hear the gates creak. Once we were sure the police had left, we decided to whip out our phones and play some Pokemon Go. There was a Pokestop in the park, and I had a Lure module to use. We'd been playing for about half an hour when we heard a loud bang come from the gate, like someone had run into it. Dagenham is known for its drunks, so we shook it off as nothing. To cut a long story short, we went back to the tents, watched a couple of action films and went to sleep. Not even an hour into my sleep, I woke up with a horrible sense of dread, like someone was watching me. All of my senses were heightened, and something wasn't right. I heard some crunching coming from behind the tent. I thought it must have been a fox until I heard it. Or, should I say, them. I managed to make out the words, "They're gonna hear us. Keep your damn mouth shut." And I quietly but violently shook Jim to wake up, and told him what I'd heard. I needed to make sure I wasn't crazy, so I asked him to listen. Whilst listening, his face turned white, and the fear spread across his face. He grabbed my arm hard and whispered, "We need to make a run for it. Just trust me." I didn't hesitate. We're quite athletic people, so running isn't a problem. And we slowly unzipped the tent and with one big breath, made a mad dash for the gates. We heard pounding footsteps and heavy breathing behind us as a guy shouted in a horrible musky voice, "Oi, slow down, we just want to play with you." And both the guys started laughing madly. Like, seriously. It was a seriously messed up laugh. We made it to the fence and leapt over it with ease. The rest was just a mad dash to my house, which was only around the corner. We made it back, slammed the door, ran up to my room and peeked out the bedroom window. We saw both guys sprint past my house, both holding something metallic. It was hard to see as it was pitch black due to the street lamp being out. Go figure. At that moment I turned to Jim and asked him why he looked so terrified back in the tent. He then went on to explain that he heard the guy say, "You grab the small one, the large one's mine. The bigger they are, the bigger the challenge." That terrified me, and we went back to the tent the next morning and found all of our stuff destroyed. The tent was slashed, portable DVD player was snapped in half, and all of our food was thrown all over the place. We never told anyone. I think we were too proud to say we ran away. All I know is that I'm never going camping again. Me and my boyfriend love to camp. About 2 weeks ago, we decided to go to the coast because we had a Friday off from our classes in university and decided to hike and camp out for the weekend. We had a 3-day plan to stay in 3 different towns and hike to each place. This story is about the first place that we stayed in. The first town was barely a town. It was more like a bunch of small houses and farmland and very, very few people. It was off-season, so normally there would have been some tourists, and since the main attraction is a huge abandoned city, left over from the times of the ancient Greek civilization, we thought it'd be rather popular. Anyway, since there were about 5 to 6 camping grounds available, one of which was highly recommended on TripAdvisor and the like, we didn't bother calling beforehand. We simply headed there and went straight to that camping area. Upon reaching it, we saw the gate open, which wasn't really unusual, but when we entered it no one seemed to be there. We knocked and called out for someone, and no one responded, except the outdoor bar, which was all open with expensive bottles of alcohol lining up and food left on the kitchen table, as we saw from the windows, so they couldn't have gone far. My boyfriend found it a bit strange that they would leave everything open like that, but assuming it was a small community with no crime, we didn't think much of it. We went to some other camping grounds to ask if they were open. The first one we went into said that they were closed due to their campgrounds being very messy these days, but they recommended us another place. We asked them about the first ground that we had went to, and strangely, the man said not to go there. We asked him why, and he just said, "I just don't recommend you going there." Anyway, the other place he told us to go about was also closed, and luckily in the meantime, I found a signboard for the first place, and it had their number on it. We called them and a man picked up, and told us that he and his wife were out for a couple of hours, and would be back in the evening. He said we could set up our camp, and that we would meet later. The place was a bit secluded, but it was quite picturesque, and we set our camp and left. We spent the whole day exploring and hiking around, and after a tiring day at around 10 p.m, after dinner, we started heading back. This is where things go extra creepy. When we got back, we found the place still empty. No one had returned, and it was quite late. My boyfriend called the owners again, and they said they had decided not to return tonight but that we could leave the money under a table mat by the door. They said the kitchen and bathrooms are open if we needed to use them, and the place was dark, and the yard was where we had set up camp, and was huge without any lighting. My boyfriend immediately starts to feel a bit uneasy. He was concerned why two business owners would leave their property completely open to two total strangers with a bar full of unopened bottles and a half-open house. As we walked towards our camp, he kept subtly expressing his uneasiness and kept looking around. He usually was pretty calm, so I told him that if he wasn't feeling so strongly about this, that we could just go to where we had had dinner earlier and stay the night in a hotel room. He opened the flashlight of his phone and kept looking around, getting more uneasy. So we agreed to pack up our camp and leave. I began to pack up, since it required a lot of folding, and he was already anxious, and I told him to just stand there and give me the light. As I packed it up, but constantly, he would move the light and check the area, as I kept getting irritated, because I could sense his worry, and at the time, I couldn't pack fast enough, because I couldn't see. At one point, he even told me in a slightly bitchy way to hurry up. And as soon as I folded the camp, we stuffed it into a bag and hurriedly packed our shit and scooted. He still seemed super anxious, and I told him to relax. The road back to the main area of the town was dark and lonely, and this is where he told me there's something I wanted to say, but not while we were still on the grounds. Well, what is it? I asked. He hesitated. Then he said he didn't want to freak me out, but he was sure that he saw someone lurking in the dark behind the wooden cabins and by the bathrooms. Twice. No one was supposed to be there except for us, and I got the chills, but I still tried to rationalize, saying it's a farm area and there must be loads of animals. Maybe a cat was moving around, but he was adamant it was a human, walking like a human would, and standing. That is why he kept checking and wanting us to hurry so much, and that's why he was telling me to hush and to keep my voice down. I almost had tears in my eyes at this point, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I kept looking back, and almost running at this point, to the lighted area of the quiet town, and only relaxed until we reached the mansion and booked the room there. We got the key, locked it, and checked it twice. I'm generally quite a skeptical person, but I really do believe my boyfriend didn't just see things. I don't know who was back there, or what could have happened, if anything, and I don't care to know. Dark and isolated places have always creeped me out. I'm glad I never met that person. I am a uni student now, but this incident happened when I was in the 8th grade. When I was around 14, I studied a subject focusing on outdoor pursuits. For our final assessment, 2 teachers took my class on a one-night camp where we would do activities like rock climbing, kayaking, and trail walking. I live in Australia, around an hour from a state forest that was notorious for the backpacker murders. Several bodies have been found, and several more remain missing. I'm pretty sure all the murders relate to the same killer. Anyway, in the morning, we leave the school and drive out in a bus. When we reach the road that leads to the entrance of the forest, a police car is parked to the side. He spoke to the teacher for a moment, but I didn't hear anything, and no one else seemed to notice or care. Fast forward a few hours, and we've trekked to the camping area somewhere in the middle of the state forest. Some parts are state and some are privately owned, I think. While kayaking that afternoon, we noticed a helicopter doing flybys, but again my classmates never suspected a thing. A couple of mates and I were the first to leave the water and helped the teacher with some equipment and started building our own rafts. I was standing off to the side when one of the national park guides walked over to one of the instructors and talked in hushed, slightly stressed out tones. I remember the instructor saying stuff like, "You're kidding, I don't believe you," and he looked incredibly shocked and taken aback. So at this point I started connecting the dots, but I didn't say anything to my school friends. And around dusk that night, I go to use the toilet, which is around 100 meters from the main campsite. As I go in, I remember a guy walking around the other side of the block. I didn't see him very clearly in the diminished light, but he kept glancing around with nervous body language. I couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't part of our party, and to me, he just didn't fit. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but fast forward to the next morning when we got back to the car park. The teacher tells us that a body was found in a dam not far from where we were. They didn't want to tell us as to not frighten us, and we later found out it was a young guy who was killed with an axe, and the guy who did it was related to the serial killer who hunted in the same area. I don't know if the guy I saw had anything at all to do with the murders, but it freaked me out a lot afterwards, and I have not been camping since. I was out camping with my mum and then 6-year-old brother when a white pickup truck pulls up into our campsite. 3 or 4 guys then get out of the truck, all wearing small, bright white lights attached to their hats that blind us from seeing their faces. They approach my mum and start asking her questions about who we were and what our plans are for the night. My little brother starts whimpering and stopped eating the Doritos he'd been happily munching on. And I got the impression that my mom was creeped out as well. So the men leave after about 5 minutes and told my mum that they were official campground employees who were just making sure that everyone was alright. Their truck certainly didn't look official, and they weren't wearing anything that would suggest that they were more than just regular, albeit creepy dudes wandering around and being nosy. My mum told my brother and we went to get in the car, and only took the essentials like clothes and a bit of food, as per her instructions. And we went to my grandmother's house and spent the rest of the night there instead. We left the tent at the campsite, giving the illusion that we were still there. Next morning, after we had told my grandmother about what happened and that we were suspicious, we went back to the campsite to gather our things and head home. When we pulled up, we immediately noticed that our stuff had been picked through by someone who wasn't us. There were footprints leading up to our tent, and the zipper was stuck, halfway open, like someone was trying to close it. It was closed when we left it, you see, and they didn't succeed. Our sleeping bags also had boot prints on them, and we never saw those guys again. But I still wonder, what would have happened if we'd have stayed? Last summer, I was camping out with a couple of friends. We were deep in the woods, and we had built ourselves a campfire. There were 5 of us in total, 2 guys and 3 girls. We were in a pretty remote part of the woods, but nobody was really worried. Anyway, we stayed up late, talking about life, telling stories and having a great time. At around 11:30, one of the girls, Ashley, shushed everyone for a second and said that she heard something. Once we were all quiet, everyone admitted to being able to hear a faint sound that resembled footsteps, but we all agreed that it was a raccoon or something. Fast forward to about an hour and a half. We were talking when suddenly we heard a very loud snapping sound, followed by a loud thump. It sounded like a large tree branch was broken off. Some of the girls were getting scared at this point, but we were able to calm them down. And eventually, we decided to try and get some sleep, and we were able to. Sometime through the night, I woke up. I have absolutely no idea how or why, but I did. I checked my phone, and it was 2:30 a.m. I lied there, staring up at the stars for a while, trying to go back to sleep. I then began to hear footsteps. They were very faint and sounded like they did earlier. They began to get noticeably closer, and after probably 5 minutes, sounded like they were only 10 feet out of range from the small amount of light still shining from our campfire. They then stopped. I waited, but there was nothing. I had a terrible feeling of being watched, and for the first time in a long time, I was truly horrified. I lied completely still, and did so for the next half hour or so. Somehow I drifted off, and at around 4:15 I heard a scream coming from the wilderness. I was incredibly exhausted, and only about half awake, but I know what I heard. It wasn't high-pitched. It sounded like whatever it was had a horrible sore throat or something. And by morning, I convinced myself it was a dream. Josh, the other guy I was camping with, mentioned it. He said it like it was nothing. Like, "Damn, did you hear that scream from the woods last night?" All I can remember about it was that I said it sent a chill down my entire body, and he just was super casual about it like it was nothing. Like I said, it was in a very remote part of the woods, and to this day, I have absolutely no idea what it could have been. I am a 26-year-old male, and I had been planning a camping trip with my wife and father for a whole year. I wanted everything to be perfect, as we don't get away from town and dive deep into the woods as often as I'd like to. This takes place in the very tree-dense Davy Crockett National Forest in East Texas. Earlier that day, my dad decided to go early and pick out a good spot for us to camp. To give a layout of where we camped, and there were 2 dirt roads on either side of us, and up an overlook to the north of us. We camped in the middle between the 2 roads. My wife and I arrived and met my dad down there at around 11 a.m. We set up our camp and proceeded to enjoy the day until around dinner time, when we started to cook our meal for the evening. Right as we got done with dinner, we see this truck circling around our campsite. He went around us several times and finally pulled right up into our campsite and got out of his truck. He then proceeded to tell us that this was his family's campsite, and how the firewood that was laying on the ground was his. Now, in this particular forest, campsites are first come, first served, and my dad had been there since 9 a.m. He then asked if he could camp next to us, and of course, being friendly, we said yes. We didn't know that when he said next to us, he meant directly on top of us. He backed his camper in so close to our tent that he blocked my truck in. We weren't sure why he was doing this, being that there were so many other campsites available, but we just shrugged it off and tried to have a good time anyway. Not that long after, we noticed a white Dodge casually circling us. We had an off feeling from this truck, because it went around several times, but we dismissed it because the area was so popular due to the overlook. After a long night of drinking and goofing off, we decided to go to bed. I was in a dead sleep when out of the woods, I wake up to a blood-curdling scream. I jolt up and ask my wife what the hell that was, and about 30 seconds later, we hear another scream off in the distance. At this point I grabbed my gun, unzipped my tent so that we could see out of it, and my dad had left a lantern burning so that we could see a little ways into our campsite. At that moment, we see the white Dodge tearing down the road behind us. They continued down the road until they were out of sight. We heard them stop and get out of their truck, slamming the door and screaming. They then proceeded to get into their truck and drive very slowly to the other road that was in front of the campsite. At this point we were terrified, thinking that they were coming to rob us, but they kept driving until they were out of sight, and then we heard them shooting. After the gunshots ended, they sped off, and at this point we thought that maybe they were just drunk and acting stupid, so we didn't call the cops. And we didn't have signal anyway, so we tried to just go back to sleep. The next day we had to make a beer run for my dad, and when we made it out the camping area and hit the highway, there were police everywhere. They had stopped 2 young boys, who we assumed were the ones who were being troublemakers the night before and continued into town. When we got back to our campsite, the cops were leaving after talking to my dad. They told my dad that the guys in the white dually had gone into a young guy's camp while they were hunting and robbed him. The boys walked up on their camp being robbed, and the Dully guys pulled guns on the young boys, proceeding to rob them at gunpoint. We think if it hadn't have been for the people that camped right next to us, as strange as it was, they would have robbed us instead. They made our campsite look bigger than it actually was, and the people in the white dually were never caught. So, people in a white Dodge, please, let's never meet again, because if you do, you may end up with a bullet in your head. This must have been around 1992, and I was camping and hiking with a friend of mine in the Lake District, and we were making our way through Borrowdale along the Derwent. It's a popular spot of the country, and there's always plenty of tourists out and about. I was following my friend, and we rounded a large boulder, and then he stopped. We did that comedy thing of me not paying attention and bumping into him behind. He indicates to me to shush, and I poked my head around to see what made him stop. Stood in the middle of the river was a masturbating man. Shirt pulled up and tucked under his chin, trousers nowhere to be seen. We sniggered, shook our heads, and took a different route. He didn't see us. We ambled and dawdled further along, and after, we stopped for a snack, and we could hear what sounded like girls squealing. We decided to investigate, and who did we see but the masturbator once again, with trousers around his ankles this time. Only this time, he's flashing at girls on the other side of the river. Gripped by an adolescent sense of justice, we decided that something must be done, but being a pair of fairly weedy nerds, we thought getting the police would be better. It was agreed that my friend would jog up to the nearest road, flag down someone to call the police, and I'd remain behind to keep an eye on Mr. Wavy Penis. I skulked, unseen behind a tree, and kept watch. After a couple of minutes, something must have unnerved the wanker. I am assuming an infuriated parent started to wade across the river or something, as he left the riverbank and headed straight through the woods towards where I was hiding. I was sitting in a hollow in the roots of a tree, and he walked straight past me and turned to look behind him. He was only feet away, and I stopped breathing. He stared through the trees for what felt like an eternity, and I thought I was doomed. Then he just turned away and headed back up to the road. I followed him to the road and figured out that he was heading for the nearest car park. My friend had gone that way to call someone to get the police, so we met up as he was coming back to find me, and we were able to get the registration of the van that the Flashman had gotten into. Within a minute of him driving off, a police car arrived, giving the full blue lights and squealing tires. We waved them down, and they were there to respond to the call that my friend had convinced someone to make when they called 999 for us. We gave a brief description and the van details, and the police were delighted, as this guy had been doing this for a few years, but people would see him and run off to call the police. But they never managed to catch him before. How did we ever cope before mobiles? And he would have disappeared, of course, by the time they arrived. We arranged to make fuller statements at the station and started to drive back. Luckily, we were parked in the same car park, and the police would follow us back to Keswick. About halfway back along the valley, I checked my rearview mirror and saw the police car slam on the brakes and throw on the lights, and then they disappeared down a track along the road. When we got to the station to make our statements, we were pulled into a side room and told to be quiet. The policeman told us that they had spotted the van as we were driving back and had gone looking for him. They'd found the flasher with his shirt off and flies undone, prowling through the woods. Unfortunately, there were no available cells in the station, so he was being held in one of the offices next to where we were. Arrangements were made to return to take part in an identity parade and point to our man. When we did return later, the police told us that he had now refused to take part in an ID parade, so we were asked whether we would be prepared to be taken into the room that he was being held in, look him in the eye and confirm it was the flasher. We agreed. It's not like we had to live there and confirmed it was the guy. Full statements were given, justice was done, and we would eventually receive a lovely letter from the Cumbrian top cop thanking us for our efforts. As we left the station, feeling rather exhilarated after our small adventure, Mr. Wagglenob's wife arrived. Before the doors fully closed behind us, we could hear her shouting, "You dirty prick! You've been doing it again, haven't you?" Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. As I mentioned in yesterday's video, the consolation prizes are now being selected via random comment selection, and they will be announced tomorrow. Well, they're not being picked now, they're going to be picked tomorrow morning. So if you listen to this early, be sure to tune back into yesterday's video to make sure you left a comment with the word consolation prize to be entered into the consolation prize draw. As I said, the winners are going to be announced in tomorrow's video at the end, so make sure you listen up, as you never know. Your name could very well be called out, which I'm sure a number of you will be very happy about. Also, in really sad news, my telephone died. I know. I've had a Samsung S5 for a few years now, and my wife and I were just out, and all of a sudden, dead. It just shows this pixelated screen constantly, which is really annoying. Because, well, I have to get a new phone. And losing all the contacts and information is really a hassle. But anyway, I'm going to probably look into getting a new phone tomorrow. So if any of you out there have some hidden gem or really recommend a certain telephone, I for one would love to hear about it, and I'll be combing through the comment section of this video tomorrow just to see if anyone has any recommendations. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, guys. Please don't forget to drop a comment, subscribe, hit the bell icon to not miss any of my posts, and as always, leave that magical like to show your love for the video. But anyway, with that being said, I think it's time to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.